Hey everyone! So, the plan today is to discuss one of the most widely used forms in music, called sonata form, or Sonata-allegro form. Sonata form rose to prevalence in the classical era, which is roughly the time period between 1750 and 1820. Let's begin with a quick discussion of the previous era's orchestra, which was really dominated by a large group of strings, all centered around a basso continuo, and a token woodwind or two, if available. The instrumental orchestral music of the Baroque tended to be organized into works referred to as a concerto grosso or a solo concerto. Both the solo concerto and the concerto grosso often based their forms on the alternation between the full group, the whole orchestra, often called the tutti, and either a small group of professional musicians, referred to as the concertino in the case of the concerto grosso, or a single virtuosic soloist in the case of the solo concerto. Moving to the classical era, the symphony developed into the four main families of instruments we're used to in today's orchestras, which includes strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. With the fully formed orchestra, the alternation of small group and big group became less popular, and the orchestra was seen more as a single cohesive unit. This would also have an effect on how the music worked. In the Baroque, the concerto grosso was generally broken into three contrasting movements, generally having a fast movement, then progressing to a slow, lyrical, kind of beautiful, calm movement, and then back to a fast movement for a big finish. The fast movements were often organized in what's called ritornello form. This fell out of favor in the classical since the ritornello form's main job was about alternating between big groups and small groups. So since the big group, small group idea went out of favor with the classical orchestra, so did the ritornello form. Its replacement is what we'll explore today, sonata form, also known as Sonata-allegro form. Let's begin our exploration of sonata form by looking at something we may have learned in English class or maybe a film class, a three-part plot structure. You might remember seeing a chart like this one in that past course, where we have an exposition, which is generally concerned with introducing our characters and establishing a setting for our story. A second part that is often called the rising action, where conflict and tension grow to a climax. And a third section, sometimes called the falling action or the denouement, where the conflict is resolved and our story comes to an end. Occasionally, you'll also see a fourth section, like that of an epilogue, which serves to kind of tie up loose ends and ensure the audience has a real sense of closure once the story or film comes to an end. Sonata form follows a very similar structure with these three main parts. The first of these sections is also called the exposition. The rising action is replaced by a section in music called the development, which is also responsible for creating tension and climax. And the resolution of that tension occurs in a third section that we call the recapitulation. Similar to the plot form, it is also common to have a fourth section whose role is to enforce a sense of closure. In music, this optional fourth section is called a coda, which comes from the Italian word for tail. Sonata form is incredibly flexible and powerful, as the framework provides the composer with almost infinite variety in what is often the longest and most intense movements of symphonies. Let's break down how things work in the three or possibly four sections, beginning with the exposition. The exposition's job is to present the listener with thematic material. Themes are often short melodies that will be varied throughout the work and will sometimes be a group of related melodies, often referred to as a theme group. You can picture each theme or theme group as an individual character being introduced. Each theme has its own specific key, functioning a bit like a character's personality. And the first is almost always presented in what's called the tonic key, which we can think of as the home key or home base. The second theme will always be an opposing key to the first, and this contrast will help provide tension later on in our story. For example, you might have a first theme in a minor key, which generally makes one feel like the character presented is tense or unhappy, which will then be contrasted with a second theme in a major key that feels more calm and content. In order to bring the listener's ear from one character to the next, we need a transitional section to help set up the new tonal center. And since the exposition will often repeat and will also need to begin the development in a new key, we also need a transition after the second theme is presented to either return to the home key for a repeat or to move us to new material in the development. Because this second transition, which is also often referred to as closing material, needs to go two possible directions, you will often hear a little fork in the musical road at the very end of this section. And it feels like it either takes the road to the repeat or turns down a new road into the development, which is often a darker, scarier road. Let's listen to the exposition of a Mozart serenade titled Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which means a little night music, performed by a great Boston-based group called A Far Cry. The development section is less rigid than the exposition, but its role is fairly consistent still. It should increase tension through the use of new and often surprising keys, and will create a dialogue between the two characters by presenting each of their themes, sometimes in fragmented or modified forms. This tension will usually build to a climax and then calm down to bring us to the next section, the recapitulation. The recapitulation is a bit of a mouthful, so often we refer to it as the recap. The recap's job is to bring us resolution. So while the format of the recapitulation is virtually identical to the exposition, there's always an important difference. While in the exposition, the two characters, or the two themes, are presented with distinct keys, the recapitulation, or recap, presents both themes in the same key. They now agree. For example, if the exposition presents theme 1 in the key of C and theme 2 in the key of G, the recap will have both themes in the home key of C. It's a bit like two characters are presented with starkly different viewpoints in the exposition. Then they kind of duke it out in the development, and after having gone through this conflict, they arrive at an agreement in the recapitulation. Finally, the coda's job, if used, is to make sure the audience knows that our story has come to an end. This will often be tacked on after the final closing material of the recap, and will frequently end with the musical equivalent of fireworks. Okay, hope that was fun and informative. See you next time.